Well, good evening, everyone. Some of the extra tables. Brendan, how are you? I know that Sheila is over making extra copies because she told me, I think about 50 would be enough. And that didn't work out quite so well. So I know there's like 4 or 5 tables that don't have the handouts. And there's also some questions. We'll try to get those to you as well. But I think watching people's time and all that kind of stuff, we need to get started. Uh, thank you, Sheila. Should I just go ahead and get started? All right, all right. Uh, for those who don't know you, there's a few people here that don't know me. I'm Father Joe Graffis. I'm the second pastor of Epiphany after Father Jim Flynn. I was here from 1981 to 1991 for 10 years. But that shows I'm really an old guy in lots of different ways. I was actually ordained just a couple of weeks before this parish started in 1971. And my mother wanted it. We all knew Jim Flynn and all that kind of stuff. So we went to the first Mass over in Owl Creek way back when. Little did I know that 10 years later I was going to be pastor here following the legend, which is Jim Flynn. Anyway, thanks for coming tonight. I know history can get dry. I'm hoping it won't be dry tonight. So those of you who have handouts, let's start in prayer. Please do. Good and most gracious God, as we celebrate a new Easter season, having survived Good Friday and now celebrating Easter Sunday, there are always dyings and risings every year in our own lives, in the lives of our parishes, the lives of our church, the lives of the world. Guide us with your wisdom as we look back to understand some of the past and how it affects us presently and how we can move forward in the future. As always, we ask you this through Christ our Lord. Amen. So what I'm going to do over these next couple of nights is we're doing 3 nights. That sounds like a lot, but we're trying to break it up a little bit. So tonight I'm going to try to cover 1,100 years. But some of it we will obviously be a little superficial about because I'll talk about that. Next week we'll start around the 1100s and go to the beginning of the 19th century or 1800. That's only 700 years. And then the last night we'll cover the last 225 years of history. I'm doing this years ago when I first put part of this together. I remember a little book, Bob might know this book, or Mary Ann, by Yves Congar, who was one of the great giants of the Second Vatican Council. This book was done in 1962. And he wrote this little book called The Power and the Poverty of the Church. It was a seminal book for a young seminarian to read. And basically what he did is, in 125 pages, try to look at 8 eras, not errors, eras of the church, and look at each one of them. And I'm kind of following his model, and of course the 9th era would be after the Second Vatican Council, the era that we live in now. But he had a really interesting model that I'll explain in a second or two. I have brought several books with me. If you're interested in more history, in your handouts, this part of this bibliography is on the back side of the outline. I'm not going to go into a lot of those types of things, but one of the great, probably simplest, concise histories of the church was done by Father Borncotter, Thomas Borncotter, a priest of the Diocese of Cincinnati. He's dead now, of course, but he did a revised version of it if somebody wants to get into the weeds a little bit more, and I brought several other possibilities. There's even Collegeville Liturgical Press has an interesting little guideline, a timeline that shows a lot of different things too that might be very helpful for some people if they want to get into it. One of the interesting ones was William Bausch, another now deceased priest of Trenton, New Jersey, did the Pilgrim Church, a popular history of Catholic Christianity. It's a very easy read, but I think a lot of that can help us as well. So those of you who might be interested in some deeper, because we've got to be pretty superficial tonight. Bibliography you have on the back there. The handout you have is the first night. You have the boiled down version of the PowerPoint, so I'm going to go into a lot more detail than you'll see on that page. But I think I want you to kind of think that you're looking on the top of a mountain. You know, you look in different ways and you can see, well, there's valleys over here and it looks like there's sheep down there and there's cows here and there's streams and waterfalls. On the top of the mountain, you see the big picture. You can't always get into the little details. And that's what I want you to not get bogged down in all the details, but kind of see the sweep through the history. One of the things Congar did in each era, he kind of said, first of all, what was the culture of the time? Which is very important to know. Secondly, what was some of the images of the Christian community or church in that era? Then thirdly, he would talk about what are some of the perhaps communication way the church communicated at that time. Number 4, which I thought was really interesting, he said, out of that era, what are some of the strengths that we see? What are some of the weaknesses that we see in that era? And one of the things that as you go through, some of those problems and questions keep coming up again and again and again in a different era. And the church begins to answer that in different ways. That kind of is a quick overview. Let me make sure I do it here. All right. So here's the 9 eras that we're going through. Tonight we're going to try to get through the first 4 of them. The first century basically is the age of the apostles and the birth of the church. Some of this you know a little bit about because of the scriptures and all that. Then the second era is from roughly 100, and when I use the word CE, it's the Christian era rather than AD, Anno Dominum. That's kind of out of respect for our Jewish brothers and sisters. So 100 to 312, just before Constantine becomes the emperor. That's the age of martyrs, persecution, the underground church. Then, coming out from underground under Constantine, we go into the third era, which is around 313 to roughly 600, the time of the rise of Islam. And that's an age of expansion and missionary foundations of churches all over Europe and into England and Ireland and all those kind of things. The fourth era that we'll try to do, we move into what's called the Dark Ages. Again, with barbarian invasions, lots of records get lost. The culture changes dramatically, especially in Europe. And it's the rise of a caste system called feudalism that we still see the effects of. So that's what we're going to try to go through tonight. Next week, we'll do the Age of Rebirth, the Renaissance, from roughly 1100 to the Protestant Reformation. Then the next era will be the beginning of the Protestant Reformation to the Age of Wars in Europe particularly, and the Catholic Reformation as well at that time. Then we'll go into roughly 1650 to First Vatican Council, which was 1870, the age of explosion in science and philosophy, and a whole Enlightenment period. And the final night we'll be dealing with from Vatican II, a little before Vatican I, to Vatican II, the age of change from empires to a different worldview, and then of course from Vatican II to today, the age of globalization and technology. If we had another night, we'd talk about American Catholic Church history. I'm not going to do that because we just don't have time to do it all. Okay? Does that make sense to you all? A little bit? It's impossible to cover all of this. So questions will always be welcome. What I'm going to try to do tonight is go through two of the eras, and then I'm going to have some time for you to talk about it at the tables, maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And I have some questions on the table that you can use, and I'll talk about that later. Then we'll come back and do the next eras of the church, and then hopefully there'll be time for another table discussion, because I want you to kind of talk about this and ask some questions as we go through. So that's our night. Does that make some sense? Okay. All righty. So, I have to realize what I'm flying here. It's like looking at a family album in many ways. Each era has a collection of snapshots, if you will, looking back and remembering. Again, as I said, what's the culture of the area? How did they understand themselves? What was the dominant image of church? Identifiable characteristics. What was the method of communication? And then some of the characters and some of the events that are key in that particular area. Okay? Fasten your seatbelts. We're not going to, I've already done that. Okay. So, number one, the first era of the church, the age of the apostles. Roughly from 25, roughly the time that Jesus died. He was born probably 7 BCE. We're not quite sure about all that timing. And of course, roughly around 100 and up to 125 is the period of what we call the New Testament, when the different books were put together. We'll talk about that. What was the culture in that first century? For the most part, it was Near Eastern, Jewish. Jesus was Jewish, in case you didn't know. Sometimes people forget that. I said his mother was Jewish. Somebody said, no, she was a Christian. I said, well, we don't know whether she was baptized or not. We assume maybe she was, maybe she wasn't, whatever was. But he comes out of the Jewish culture and the Near Eastern culture, which is very different than our culture. And sometimes we get that confused. If you've ever had the opportunity to go to Israel, you begin to see that. Near Eastern people think very differently than we do, and the way they process things are differently. And so to try to understand the scriptures, we got to get out of our culture and sometimes into their culture. But a lot of the symbols and the stories that we hear about in the first century are very heavily Near Eastern. They're very full of symbols. As you know about the scriptures, is mainly metaphor. It's not historical fact about things, and that gets some people really upset. But that's the way Near Eastern people thought, through story and symbols. The image of the church in that first century is they're finding themselves. They're struggling. There's no real institutional church as we think about it today. in the 21st century. They did go out and were missionary and evangelical. They were spreading the good news where they could, especially when they weren't being persecuted. And the emphasis at that time was looking for people's gifts, or charisms is another word for that. So how do we lift up the gifts of the Spirit? And how does the Spirit moving among us? And who might be, we need to call forth to lead us, and who might do this and that. So there wasn't a hierarchy at all as we think of it today. And the other word would have been diakonia, from which we get the word deacon, service. How do we do outreach? It's not just about us. It's about how we serve not only our community, but we go beyond our community. Many of those things you hear in the scriptures. The style, of course, was very much like Jesus was peripatetic, went around. You got a group of disciples together. You talked about it. You shared stories. You broke bread together. You reflected on the word as you knew it at that particular time. So there's no classroom type of thing as we think of it today. It's walking with people, going where they are. Sounds reminiscent of Pope Francis, doesn't it? Encountering people, meet them where they are. All comes out of the church. Obviously, Israel in the first century was a backwater. It was nowhere compared to Rome and Greece and many of the major cities at that particular time. Rome was probably about 1 million people in the first century. Now, by the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages, it went down to 25,000 people. It was nowhere in the Middle Ages, and the only one that was around to run the place was the Pope, or the Vicar of Rome. So Israel was no one. And of course, you had great people like Herod wanted to build these magnificent buildings like the temple and all those kind of things to try to get us recognized. But of course, if you wanted to do anything, you needed to cooperate with the Romans because they were the Nazis of the time. They ruled. You're a peasant. Know your place. And of course, we see that often in the Passion. Asia Minor was what it was at that time was Greece and what we called it present-day Turkey. That was one kind of known area. Weren't two separate countries in the first century. And of course, that's a lot of where Paul is going to be spreading the gospel during that place. So that's kind of the culture that we're looking at in the first century. Obviously, I told you about Jesus. St. Paul lived roughly from about 10 CE to 67. His conversion happened after Jesus was crucified. He did not know Jesus, never met Jesus. Obviously, you know the story of Paul, that he persecuted Christians. He came from a Pharisaical background and thought he was doing the right thing by persecuting Christians. Later on, he has that conversion experience on the road to Damascus, whether that's historical or whatever it might be. He had some conversion experience and then begins to repent of all of that. And so the first writings of the New Testament come from Paul, his letters. Earliest letters, probably Thessalonians, happens around 47. So that's roughly 15, 20 years after Jesus' death, that he's writing letters to different people. And he's writing these letters from roughly 49 of the first century to roughly 65 of the first century. And one of the things we'll see is the Jerusalem Council happened around 49 of the first century. What happens in those kind of things? Paul writing letters, trying to communicate. Some of his letters, we know, were written by Paul. The Corinthian letters probably. Looks like Galatians and Romans. Some of the other letters, like Ephesians and Colossians, and some of those might not have been written by Paul, but by some of his students. They attributed themselves to Paul. That was a common thing that people did in the first century. But most scholars can look at those writings and say it's a little different style in some of those letters than some of the basic letters of Paul. An epic moment in the first century, of course, is the Council of Jerusalem. At that particular point in time, you had, obviously, Peter was the leader of the apostles. Paul, of course, was around, but he had already began some of his trips into what is Asia Minor. And the question came up and Christians are part of the Jewish community, Jewish Christians. Well, if we have converts, do we make them Jews first to go through all Jewish rituals, circumcision, for example, and all that? Or do we just teach them about Jesus and baptize them? Many of the disciples, obviously Peter was very upset about that. They were very, very strong Jews. And they didn't think of them as separate from Judaism, although they thought Jesus had been in the process of trying to renew Judaism. So Peter calls for council. This is the first of what we call ecumenical councils like Vatican II. At the council, we're not sure who all was there. Obviously, disciples. Sounds like could have been some women there, could have been some other people there. We just don't know. But they argued with each other for almost a year. Are we Jews or are we Christian? And of course, Peter and Paul have an argument with each other. And Paul ultimately stomps out, says, I'm sorry, I'm going to go baptize the Gentiles. They believe in Jesus, that's what we ought to do. Peter was horrified by that. But obviously, as we hear in the Acts of the Apostles, he had some experiences somewhere along the line that don't you call unclean what I call clean? An experience from God, whatever that mystical experience was. And then he met a man named Cornelius who wanted to become baptized. And finally, Peter agrees with Paul. And that's an epic moment for the church to say, we don't have to be Jewish. We can be Christians separate from Judaism. But that also caused us very strong reaction from the Jewish community. And there are persecutions that happen. So it's this turmoil period in many different ways. The Gospels, of course, as you know, I'm sure Father Tuan is really trying to get this to. I think we sometimes think somebody was sitting there, if you're watching The Chosen, which is not bad, but Matthew is writing all kinds of things down in The Chosen, and as if, I'm getting ready to write a gospel. I doubt if he had any clue of writing a gospel when he was with Jesus, maybe much later. The earliest of the Gospels is Mark, often called Stark Mark, because it's the starkest, the shortest, and the briefest of the Gospels. And of course, Luke and Matthew write their Gospels probably 10 years later, and they are aware of Mark's Gospel, but they add a lot of different stories from their background. Matthew, because he was Jewish, is speaking to a Jewish culture, uses a lot of Jewish images and quotations from the Old Testament. Luke, on the other hand, is writing to a Gentile culture, so he's using a different. And each, of course, of the Gospels, John is writing much later, probably in the 90s. It may have been John or his disciples who finally put his gospel together. My professor Ray Brown often said probably John's gospel went through 5 editions. What we have now is the last of the 5 editions. But he writes a totally different gospel emphasizing Jesus as divine. Whereas in Mark's gospel, Jesus is very human. It doesn't say he's not divine, but he emphasized the humanity. Luke, the healer and reconciler, the doctor image, at least of someone who's healing stories. And Matthew's gospel, imitating the Old Testament, he even divides it into 5 sections like the Torah. And one of the sections is the 10 Beatitudes, 10 rather than 8, for the 10 Commandments. And it ends with the Matthew 25, the criterion for how do you enter heaven. But Matthew speaks to a Jewish community. So each of these Gospels come together emphasizing different things. They're not trying to write a history. They're trying to describe their faith experience based on the stories of the past. So they're different images of Jesus and actually different images of church in each of the Gospels that we get out. Later on, the pastoral letters we attributed to Paul probably were not written by Paul at all, Timothy and Titus. But he's handing on whoever's writing these stories to the next generation and talking about. And we begin to see some different images of church when these are written. The images of presbyter, from which we get priest. The image of episkopoi, the one who has oversight role, from which we get bishop. And certainly, obviously, in the book of Acts, we get the idea of diaconia, those who are the social workers of the first century and the first century communities. We see the formation of those, but whether anybody was ordained as we think of it today is certainly under question. Certainly wasn't the same way. But you see the formation of those 3 orders of the church. It's pretty obvious in Paul's writings that there were women deacons in the first century. Some of the questions today, well, were they ordained or were they not ordained, and all those kind of questions? Nobody was ordained. So we can't answer that question, but I'll leave that to other people to decide. But we get the roots of all of this, but you just don't have an institutional church in any way, shape, or form like we see together. The book of Revelation, of course, is one of the last books of the first century, maybe going into the second century. Obviously attributed to John, again, probably by one of his disciples. And that was written, these writings, somewhere 80s and 90s of the first century. Letter of Peter could be as late as 120. So there's a lot of things, but nothing is settled. There are a Christian community gathering in homes, breaking bread together, often going to the temple, sometimes until they get thrown out of the temple. But they take a lot of temple worship and synagogue service, the word service that we have in the Eucharist, and then, of course, the breaking of the bread in terms of the body of Christ. So what are some of the strengths and the weaknesses in this particular area? Very little doctrine. No catechisms in the first century. We don't even get anything close to that until the 4th and 5th centuries, or the 3rd and 4th centuries. Very little structure. We see the beginning of some structure. But there are new ministries. As I said, the deacons. And they're being formed and shaped by different ways. And the 3 major leaders of this time, Peter, Paul, and John, each come out of different parts of the church. And each of them has a slightly different theology. Peter, because of his background, was more conservative in the best sense of that word. Conservative means preservative. Conserving the best in the tradition. He didn't want to lose that tradition. Now, Paul comes out of that as well, but he says, we got to think out of the box. And so Paul is more the progressive, if you will, of the first century, thinking out of the box, doing ministry, discerning gifts in various communities, forming communities like that. John, of course, we think he may have been in Asia Minor for a while. There's a home there where Mary may have died in Ephesus. Most scholars are not too sure about that. There's two places in Jerusalem where she may have died, so we don't know. But we have a lot of places like that. But John emphasizes that idea of the charisms and what we might call today the charismatic community. Well, there's tensions between all three of those theologies, as we still have in the church today, between those people. So, some of the weaknesses, perhaps, we don't have clear structure, but we're beginning to move toward a structure as we begin to form communities. There's no real central leader as the Bishop of Rome, but Peter had gone to Rome. Peter and Paul had both died in Rome, so the place of prominence was Rome. So the Bishop of Rome is respected because he's the successor of Peter. First among the equals. Wasn't better than any other as we develop into bishops, but primary. And we see that repeated over and over again. And of course, the big split was splitting from the mother, from Judaism, and not just being a sect of Judaism. Yes.
Why do you or Congar look at a split with Judaism as being a weakness rather than a strength? Because it might have not developed.
Well, I think the question was that why would you consider that a weakness? A weakness in the sense that suddenly the church is on its own, where it had a structure in Judaism, and now we're having to create new structures. And how do we go with that? So maybe weakness is the wrong word, but a challenge for sure. Does that make sense? Okay. So, some of the characters, obviously Peter, not well educated, chosen leader, but a lot of flaws. Big mouth Peter. Cautiously conservative, but the first bishop of Rome. John, the youngest disciple, is more the mystic, as we see in his writings, an evangelist, of course, shaper of that Greek charismatic community, which still affects us in many ways, and we need to respect that. Paul, well-educated, persecutor then convert. The missionary, he begins to say we got to be about mission. Schooled in Jewish thought, but probably the shaper of Christian theology in the first century is Paul, more than anyone else, because of his letters and his writings. We don't know much about the successors of Peter, but at the end of the first century, St. Clement was the third successor. He was a writer of a lot of things that had been preserved, and was the first of what we will call the early fathers of the church. They were all male. I have no doubt that there were mothers of the church as well. They just weren't writing things down as the fathers were. He writes a letter to the Corinthians at the end of the first century, so we begin to see that. Okay. Key events, I mentioned the Council of Jerusalem, Peter and Paul both martyred in Rome. Peter on the hill where the Vatican lies now, and as you know, Peter is buried underneath the Basilica of St. Peter's. Just recently, in the last 70 years, did we find that his tomb was there. Paul was killed because he was a Roman citizen outside the walls of the city of Jerusalem, probably beheaded, and St. Paul's outside the walls is another basilica where Paul is buried, is reconciled. The other two basilicas are Mary Major, right next to the train station. That's where Francis is buried. And ironically, if you know, I knew that church well. He decided to be buried in a closet. I remember this place. There are two confessionals, and there was a closet between the two confessionals. And that's where he decided to be buried, which is an interesting story. His tomb just says Francisco. Doesn't say Pope, just says Francisco with the cross. Tells you a lot about the man, doesn't it? Obviously, a major factor in the persecutions of Christians was the destruction of the temple. And by the Romans in 70 A.D., there was a Jewish revolt several years before. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, there's Masada, where a lot of them hid out until the Romans took it. That's another interesting story. But because the Romans destroyed the temple, and the temple, this is the second temple, the temple of Herod. There had been a temple of Solomon, but it got destroyed in the exile in 500, 600 before Jesus. That kind of turned people against, and of course, Nero during that time also started persecuting a lot of Christians. So that's where the persecutions over the next couple of decades and centuries come from. I talked about the split four Gospels. Christians became the great cities as the early Christian community leaves Israel for the most part. The great cities become in Asia Minor, Greece and Turkey. North Africa, the church spreads across North Africa, obviously gets to Spain, and obviously gets to Italy. But the church kind of moves out of Israel, although there's still remnants of the church there. Okay, first era, first 100 years. We'll go a little faster. I'll make sure I've got my time right here. Okay. The second era, these next 200 years roughly. Suddenly the church is now more in Europe, Northern Africa, Greece, and Turkey. Different culture. Some of North Africa has remnants of Near Eastern culture, but now you've got our Greek and Roman culture, a very different way of thinking and structuring. And since you're centered in Rome, where the power is, certainly during this time, the church begins to adopt some of that culture. How did the Romans structure themselves? How did we begin to structure the church? And you begin to see, during this period of time, what we call the pyramid church, the hierarchical church. Somebody's on top, and then there's different levels, and somebody's at the bottom, as that was clear in Roman society. But obviously the influence of Greek culture, a lot of the philosophical cultures of Greece, certainly Aristotle and Plato, begins to structure the language of the church during this period of time. And many of the theologians that came out of this speak from those cultures. For the most part, the church is underground. Again, there aren't church buildings at this point in time. But people met in homes for the most part. Or sometimes, if they could, they'd rent a hall where the communities would gather. Gather for the word, gather for breaking bread together, and then sending people out on mission. So most of these underground communities, trying to hold it together because you're under persecution, spiritual values became very, very important. But it's now the church becomes Mediterranean-based, and later on what we would call European-based. The rise of the episkopoi, or bishop, as kind of the center of unity. You need to elect a bishop, someone who will lead the community. And usually you try to get somebody who was a good theologian, who could speak well, who could preach well, who was a good teacher. That's not always been the qualifications for bishops in recent years. But hopefully we're going back to that. But anyway, but the rise of the episcopoi, and then gradually the presbyters became the priests, and gradually, since the bishop couldn't go to all the communities, he would send a priest there to represent him in leading those various communities. And of course, trying to make sure the service was done. The deacons or the diaconias or the deaconesses would be looking at food, shelter, clothing, whatever people needed to have. How do we distribute that, as we hear in the book of the Acts of the Apostles? Yeah. Okay. Much more structure. Obviously, structure begins to happen. Somewhat a little more rigid, but much more control. You have to, but in an underground church, you've got to keep tight control or things are going to go chaotic. So there's more a notion of authority and tight communities. As I said, many of the bishops of this time and preachers are the people that hold this together. The church grows very rapidly across northern Africa. Later on, that's going to be destroyed by Islam. But at this point in time, and of course it's through going through Africa that we get across the isthmus there and into Spain. Italy, of course, you have a lot of the church growing there, and then gradually into France, Gaul, and eventually into the northern parts of Europe. Unfortunately, the weakness, again, as Congar said, is suddenly there become a split between clergy and lay, and a separation of, well, you're clergy over here, so you need to have some different dress compared to laity. Your authority is over laity, and we begin to see that split. Can have some good aspects. Somebody has to lead. On the other hand, we've also seen some bad aspects come up. In the midst of persecution, some people abdicate or become apostates. I was a Christian, but they came and they said, if you don't deny Christ, you're going to get killed. Okay. You know, people caved. That never happens today, of course, right? People cave, and then the question of how do you receive if they want to come back a couple years later? You know, I denied my Christianity, but I want to come back and be Christian. How do we do that? How do we receive them back? That became a question. Can we receive them back? We still have that question today, don't we? And sometimes, obviously, with this persecuted underground church, you get a bunker mentality. But still, there's very little defined doctrine during this period of time. Some of the great characters, some of these names you may have heard of, not heard of. Ignatius of Antioch wrote many letters in the 2nd century. He was martyred in the Circus Maximus in Rome, saying that I'm like wheat for the Lord, as wheat is crushed, become bread. That's what my death is like. Polycarp of Smyrna was a disciple of John, a friend of Ignatius. Argued for, let's establish what's the date of Easter, because they weren't quite sure. We're still debating that question with our Orthodox brothers and sisters today. He was one of the classic philosophers in the middle of the 2nd century. Irenaeus of Lyon is in France, southern France, was a Gallic theologian, kind of talked a lot about, based on, we need to talk our tradition and Scripture. And that becomes kind of a marking points for us. What's the Word say? What does our tradition say? And how do we balance the two? That goes through all of these centuries. The teaching of the apostles as how do we make this an organic whole? It's not just the word, but it's also what's been handed down to us from generation to generation. Tertullian, never a saint, was an African lawyer and theologian. He was the first one to translate some of the Greek thought of the time into Jewish terms. He coined the word Trinity. We didn't have a word for Trinity. Can you imagine? And used the word consubstantial, which we kind of keep repeating. I'm not sure any of us understand when we say the creed, consubstantial with the Father, because how is the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, how are they interconnected? How are they related to one another? As one God, three persons in one God, his word was consubstantial. Not sure it's helpful. That's a totally different philosophical statement than we think in. Clement of Alexandria, he emphasized in the beginning of the 3rd century, we need to enculturate. We're now doing other cultures, like the French culture and the Italian culture, and we're beginning to move into other parts of Europe and across Africa. How do we take what was Jewish and Near Eastern and enculturate it? A term that we still have to deal with today. And certainly at the Second Vatican Council, enculturation became a really important thing. Another theologian, not canonized as saint, was Origen. He was a pacifist. And most Christians of this time were very anti-war and saying you shouldn't be a soldier. So pacifism was the stance of what does Christ say in the gospel? Sometimes we hear that today with Pope Leo. But the early Christian community did not see a reason for violence of war. But Origen also begins to study the scriptures as they begin to know it and try to do how do we get out of the scriptures principles for living Christian life. He established a Christology, that's a fancy word, for the study of Christ. Of course, there's the Jesus of history, and there's Jesus of the Christ, the Messiah, the theological figure. How do we discern all that? Jesus Christ is true God and true man, but they didn't understand that in this century. It's another centuries later that's going to happen. He gets exiled. Another giant African, you can see the influence of Africa here, is Cyprian of Carthage. He begins to talk about how do we receive people back in the church, begins to talk about the sacrament of penance, what we consider penance. How do we forgive people? What process do they need to go through? And begins to raise those questions. Do we do that as a community? We do it individually? What do we do? No definite ideas at that point in time. But how do we welcome people back? We got to do that. Okay. Some of the key events of this period. In the 2nd century, you begin to see the beginnings of what we might call the Desert Fathers, but it's the monastic movement, religious orders, people banding together as a community, especially in Africa, and banding together to be a community and emphasizing the great evangelical virtues of poverty. We don't need a lot of money, chastity, celibacy, and obedience. And the foundation of some of those principles, and many of them were living very simple lives and saying, we got to get back to the gospel. We're getting distracted by a lot of other things. We're forgetting the gospel. What did Jesus tell us we should do? And you begin to see a countercultural movement with that. By the end of the 3rd century, Rome is dividing itself between the East and the West. I think in your in the green sheet that you have there is a map that I put for you, just to kind of help you to understand the journeys of Paul and just knowing where the church is at this time. Rome, of course, is what we call the Western Church, primarily European now. But the Near Eastern Church was in Constantinople. And Constantine actually went to Constantinople. And that's mostly Middle Eastern. So there's two different cultures in Rome, and the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire begin to split. They're still loosely together. They don't completely split until the next century. But they become two very different centers, which is going to lead later on to a split in the church. So the African influence was heavy with many of the intellectual lights. Christians survived the persecutions. They're off and on. They aren't continuously. But the emphasis was on spirituality. Okay. So we've done two of those. Yes. No. I mean, it's an influence, and we're going to get to that in this period of time. Something like that. Well, I've done two of these, and I want to give you at least a little bit of time to talk about this in your groups, and then we'll go through the last two of these eras tonight. Are you with me, or is this hopefully simple enough to kind of get to see the broad strokes? So I'd like for on your table, and you've got a sheet, some of you have, 3 questions. If you get to them all, fine. If you don't, that's fine too. Of what you've seen so far out of this, what's the one learning experience that was a new insight to you that you didn't realize before, based on those two? What secondly question is, having seen part of this, how does it help you see where we are today? And I forgot the third question. And seeing that kind of history, what concerns do you have, having heard that history? Well, I thought, the Pope wore a hat in the first century, and then Peter have a hat. No, he didn't exactly do that, and all that kind of stuff. So take a few minutes in your tables, and if there's a question that arises, kind of somebody write it down, and we'll try to deal with some of them, because we're about halfway through our night. I hate to break you up, but we do need to roll on. Does anybody have some particular questions? A couple of people asked some questions. Somebody asked about the question of Gentile. Gentile is anybody who's a non-Jew. You're Jewish, going through Jewish ritual, or a non-Jew. That could be different cultures. Kind of like you're American and you're a non-American. That was just a dividing point. Beg pardon? Don't go there. Let's see, somebody else asked a question. I should. If you have a question, bring it up, but go ahead. No. Well, there were many disciples of Jesus. Some left, and some stayed. But the 12, again, we don't know how long they stayed together, but they did split up in terms of obviously Peter eventually going to Rome. By history, by legend, Thomas went to India. James went to not James. One of the Jameses was in Jerusalem, probably not one of the apostles, but James, one of the apostles, went to Spain. So we've got some evidence of them moving beyond, but it's very sketchy. Anybody else have a burning question that we can answer? Okay. Paul never met Jesus. Right. Saul, but Paul, but probably never met Jesus. Now, by the Acts of the Apostles, he was at the stoning of Stephen, but that was several years after Stephen, the first deacon. That was several years after Jesus' death. We don't even know how long that was. Could have been 5 years, but there's no evidence that Paul ever met the historical Jesus. Obviously, by the book of Acts, that he had an experience of Jesus that caused his conversion. Man named Linus. You don't know much about him. No.
When was the New Testament written to such a point that they could actually use it as a teaching?
It's a good question. I mean, I think when was the New Testament formed so they could use it in their teachings? Probably a lot of these documents, they were formed, between Jesus' death in 30 and Mark, roughly in 70. These stories are being told over and over again, and they're kind of grouped in various things like parables and miracles and stuff like this, and different groups kept that. Now, one of the things we forget about, oral tradition was very important because that's how you preserve things. We don't do that very well, our family histories and all that kind of stuff. But they, parents always said, remember this story or remember this story, or keep this in mind, memorize it and pass it on. So a lot of those, but in terms of the formula, as we see the Gospels, Mark's Gospel, again, 70, 80 roughly, Luke and Matthew's, John 90 of the first century. They didn't have copies because people couldn't read for the most part, or only the elites could read, but these kind of got passed around. Now, the scriptures as we know it, we'll get into this next century. When was the canon of the scriptures formally approved? Doesn't happen until the 4th and 5th centuries. But these got passed around. Okay, can we move on to these next two ones? I'm being conscious of your time. If anybody has to go to the bathroom, please do it. So now we're into this next era. We got this one and one more to do tonight. 700 year, roughly 600 year, 300 years. Suddenly, the church is kind of stuck with that split of Rome between a European culture and what we might call Oriental. We think of Orient being the Far East. I'm thinking of it as Oriental being Near East, basically what's called Turkey and, again, Syria, and that. Two very different cultures, and that causes tension. But during this time, because of, as you all remember, with Constantine, won the battle of the Milvian Bridge in roughly around 312, 313. Not long after he became the emperor, he became a convert to Christianity. He waited to be baptized until the very end of his life because he, if you get baptized, all your sins are forgiven, but what if I do some sinning after that? So I'm going to wait till the last minute, and fortunately he got baptized in the last minute. But because he became a Christian, his mother, Helena, was a Christian, had become a Christian. Suddenly, and he's the emperor, he brings Christianity out of the underground and makes it the official religion of the empire, which I'm sure got a lot of people like, what? So if you want to rise in the Roman culture, you need to be a Christian. Now, a lot of people became Christians not for the right reason. That never happens today, of course, but so suddenly, and of course, being an institutional guy, like an emperor is, he began to say, now, wait a minute, things are still a little fuzzy around here about what, I mean, I don't know what your doctrine is, and, you guys need to come down and write this down so that we have it. He didn't say the word, but I need a catechism. And of course, that's what's going to happen when we have places like the great councils that come up with Nicaea, and we come up with what's the Nicene Creed. But there's a rapid missionary expansion now to expand Christianity, not always for the right reasons. And so France and Germany begin to dominate as we're in that area. The barbarians haven't come yet. That's going to be another problem. But one of the bad things that happens here is because the church or the state is pushing for the church, it also wants something from the church. So that, okay, if the state is, we want to pick the bishops now, okay? I want the guys that's loyal to me. That never happens, does it, in our time? But so the church unfortunately gets tied up with the state, which we always have problems when we get tied up with the state, or overly cooperate with the state sometimes. But it also begins to be much more institutionalized, and we see what we call today Christendom comes out of this era. And some good things happened. The gospel got spread, but there's also some downsides that we still see today sometimes. There's always a counterculture movement. I mentioned it in the last section. And in this section, religious orders began to increase. The Benedictines is one of the first of those orders. And people become very attracted by these monasteries because they're getting back to the basics. They're living a simple life. They're praying well. They're going out and serving the community. But that gets to be a tension between the religious communities and sometimes what we call today the diocesan communities. The bishops don't have as much control over those communities, and that causes tension sometimes if you're heavy into control. That never happens today, does it? But so the rise of monks and missionaries, and they begin to constantly raising questions. Are we doing this right? Is this what Jesus wanted us to do? And you're always going to see a countercultural movement over and over and over again in the church. And oftentimes that counterculture movement, people start saying, well, they're heretics and they're renegades and all that, and they're kooks and all that kind of stuff. Wait till we get to Francis of Assisi. Those people are crazy. Be careful, because in the next century they're going to be canonized. And the people that wanted to control them don't get canonized in lots of ways. So the monks are always raising those questions. Let me get here. Am I doing okay with... Jim Jr. was telling me I keep going like this rather than this. I keep forgetting we're taping this. So this age of expansion, some of the strengths are there's a growth in what we call today the known world, the European section of as you see on that map. The monastic movement grows and becomes more popular. People flock to monasteries for spiritual direction, for a lot of different things. So but that causes a tension between the institutional church and the monastic movements. I mentioned desert spirituality. People go, Jesus went out into the wilderness to pray. So people said, you got to get away from it all to really get into prayer. And sometimes, as we know, even in Jesus' day, cities corrupt people. When you get into the rural area, when you're tied to the earth and the ground, you become much more spiritual in lots of ways. Jesus saw that. He was always going out to go out into the woods, go out somewhere else. There you can get in touch with God. But in all the distractions of the cities, we sometimes get distracted away from God. We begin to see that. Doctrines begin to be developed. We begin to write things down as what are our beliefs. Not because the church has to do that, but because the government, the state, asks us to do that. Liturgical life is at its high point during this time. Now suddenly we have buildings. Basilica comes from having a meeting hall where we're going to meet. We may meet for the liturgy of the word and then the breaking of the bread, and then we'll have supper afterwards. But church buildings began to be built as places of worship, centers of faith and communities. And of course, out of this period of time, as we begin to have, one of the things that the Second Vatican Council tried to emphasize is going back to these 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, seeing as it developed liturgy and saying, let's see what they did way back and then. What have we lost out of that through the Middle Ages? So the so-called new Mass that we have goes back to the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. It does not go back to the 16th century where the Tridentine Latin Mass came from. I said this to one of my younger brother priests. I said, I'm a traditionalist. Oh, you are? Oh, I'm glad to hear that. I thought all you old guys were not traditionalists. I said, yes, I go back to the 4th, 5th, and 6th century. You just go back to the 16th century. That's 1,000 years later. You're a modernist. I'm a traditionalist. He said, I don't understand what you're talking about. I said, you might want to pick up a book, and study a little history, because that's what the Vatican Council is, a much earlier history than the 16th century. We still haven't got that through to some people today, but bless me, Father, for I have sinned. One of the weaknesses, of course, is with all these ideas is the beginning of many different heresies and questions. Part of that is why we needed to say, well, let's define some of this doctrine, because people are saying, well, Jesus was human, but he wasn't God. No, Jesus was God, but he wasn't human. All kinds of questions that happen this, and sometimes divisions in the church. Can you imagine people getting divided? And how do we resolve those heresies? And again, the biggest split becomes that tension between East and West. I'll get this straight sometime here. Okay, whoops. Oh, I'm going backwards. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, okay. This goes back to your question on the table here about the 4 major councils of the Nicene Creed. Constantine said, okay, I want you to come up with what do we believe in the church? And of course, Nicaea is not very far. As you know, Pope Leo went there last year on the 1500th anniversary of Nicaea, where bishops met in council to try to decide, is Jesus God, man, what? It affirmed the divinity of Jesus and the equality of the Father and the Son. So for the first part of what we call the Nicene Creed comes out of Nicaea. Roughly 50 years later, a second council, first Constantinople, right next door to Nicaea, said, well, what about the Spirit? If we're talking about a Trinity, is the Spirit divine? And how is he related to the Father and Son? And of course, they had to resolve that. Co-equal with the Father. 3 persons in one person. Another 50 years passes, and at Ephesus, which is still in Turkey, kind of down the coast, if you ever get a chance to go to Ephesus, it's an amazing city. And of course, there, by tradition, John took Mary to Ephesus. We don't know whether that's historically accurate or not, but Marian devotion was very important. So Ephesus defined Mary as the mother of God because she gave birth to Jesus, who was God. And of course, it's out of that Jesus is true God and true man. Not exactly an easy concept to gather. Where is he God? Where is he man? Well, he's both. Jesus feels everything that we feel as in our human experience, but he was also God. Don't ask me to explain it. It's a mystery. And yet, that's what they came up with, true God and true man. 20 years later, Chalcedon, which is again in the same area, what Christ has the two natures, fully divine, fully human. And one of the things that comes out of these four councils is always, what is the church? The church is one. Unity should always be important. How do we maintain unity? How do we, even within our diversity, unity and diversity? Unity does not necessarily mean uniformity, that everybody has to do exactly the same thing. And of course, in these councils and there have been different rites in the church, different ways of celebrating Eucharist. We even have several different rites in our church today, especially coming out of India. We've got a lot of Indian priests who are from the Sino-Malt tradition. They just celebrated a mass for all of us as priests one day, and it's it basically is similar to our liturgy, but the order is different, and yet, it's recognized by the church. But how do we maintain one? Holy, we're all, Second Vatican Council, all of us are called to holiness. Now, holiness doesn't necessarily mean pious, and, I pray all the time, and, it's me and God, me and God, me and God, me and God. No, that's not what holiness means. Holiness comes from the word whole, holistic. You're a whole person. And how can we be fully whole persons? A fully whole person can be holy. Sometimes we've misunderstood that word a lot. Catholic, we're Catholic. That means we're Catholic and you're Protestant. No, Catholic means universal. We're a universal church. We cover the whole world. We cover many different cultures and ethnic groups. So Catholic means how do we maintain our universality as a family? And fourthly, apostolic. That doesn't mean you're an apostle, but it means as an apostle, you're sent out. You're out on a mission. Pope Francis says we all need to be missionary disciples. So as a church, we have always got to reach out and evangelize. We've forgotten how to do that sometimes. Wait a second, I'm going backwards here. Basically, because much of the church community at that time was in those areas. The emperor was in Constantinople, so he called for the people there. The Italian church had not really grown as much as, all the Pauline communities of Philippi and Corinth. And if you go to, I know Father Chuck Walker, and he's got a whole group that's going right now through Turkey. They can't go to Turkey, but they got canceled on Turkey, but they're because of the war. But they're going through a lot of Greece. It's fascinating to see where all those early Christian communities are. Sadly, as we see all this about Turkey, Turkey today is hardly Christian at all. So a lot of the places you don't, the whole all the cities of the book of Revelation, 7 cities, Laodicea, and all that, they're all in ruins now, which is really kind of sad. It's part of the reason I think Leo went back to Nicaea to say we need to look back at our roots. Okay? Some of the characters here, obviously I've mentioned Constantine, his mother. She built many churches, obviously in Rome. The original St. Peter's in Rome, they began to build a church over or under what we now call St. Peter's Basilica, which was not built until the 15th and 16th century. Helena went to Israel and supposedly found the true cross there. Don't know whether that's historically accurate or not, but we're still looking for the true cross. But she did establish a church in the site where today's Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is over Golgotha. It's a fascinating church, totally difficult to understand because there's the Orthodox have a part of the church, the Latin Catholics have a part of the church, the Coptic Egyptians have part of the church, and they all get kind of mixed up sometimes. It's interesting, but I love that church. And of course, it was built over a garden, and in the middle of the garden was this stone fist, which they put the uprights for the crucifixion. Usually just the upright. You carried the crossbar, which is we see in sometimes some of our pictures of Jesus carrying the crossbar, and then you just nail the crossbar on top of that upright post. So it's not quite total cross that we sometimes see. That's why you see St. Francis of Assisi, the tau cross is a T. Part of that. Anyway, too much detail. Some of the great giants during these various councils was Basil and Athanasius, great theologians and defenders of this understanding of what does it mean to be Christ, Jesus the Christ, the Son of God. Irenaeus was a heretic who denied the divinity of Jesus. Probably most people in this period of time, early part of the 4th century, did not believe Jesus was divine. It took the council to articulate what John was saying in his gospel, Jesus is divine. Later on in that century as well, Ambrose of Milan becomes a great teacher. He's the one that ends up baptizing St. Augustine. Of course, Augustine was the product of a Christian mother and a very pagan father who womanized all over the place. So Augustine learned it well from his dad for a while until he was converted in his early 30s and then becomes one of the great theologians, probably the greatest theologian of these centuries, following in the footsteps of Ambrose. Ambrose, of course, battled the Emperor Theodosius in many different ways. John Chrysostom, you've heard the name, becomes one of the great preachers, but he usually preached for an hour, so most of us wouldn't like that. At one of my last parishes, one of the parishioners there was a character. I had his funeral later, but he always said, "Father, no homily should be more than 4 minutes." See, if you're longer than 4 minutes, I'm walking out of the church. I said, "Good luck." But I do try to keep it to 8 minutes. Unless you're in a black parish and they say, "Keep preaching, Father, keep preaching, Father," which we could do. And then we go from a black parish to a white parish, back and forth. You have to deal with it. Sometimes on weekends, I've gone to a parish in Okolona, next morning to a parish in Pleasure Ridge Park, later on that morning to west end of Louisville. Same homily, 3 different styles. I've learned to do that. Preacher, golden mouth, his sermons are written down and in the office of readings in the divine office. There's lots of homilies from him. Interesting. Chrysostom means golden mouth. One of the interesting characters is Jerome, the father of scripture scholars, lived most of his life in Jerusalem in some of the caves underneath the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, and they preserved a lot of those. Evidently a really eccentric man, but he translated all of the Hebrew scriptures from Hebrew and Greek into Latin, the Latin Vulgate, which is a major translation. Can you imagine one man translating the entire Bible from the original languages into Latin? But it took him forever and ever and ever. But one of the real giants of scripture scholars, my teacher Ray Brown, wrote the Jerome Biblical Commentary, which is now in its third edition, and he said, I got to dedicate this to Jerome for lots of reasons. Well, many different things, and there's a lot of things that I have to skip over quickly, but part of it was the worship of statues, idolatry, or and a lot of different people, you know, you got a statue of Mary. Statues, art began to be coming during this period of time. Are you worshiping an idol? And of course, Romans did. Had all kinds of statues of the Greek gods and stuff like this, and that was a challenge between the emperor and some of the theologians for lots of different reasons. And there were other things about separation of church and state. We are separate from you. I heard today on the way driving here that evidently the present administration called in one of the Vatican people and said, you need to tell your Pope to shut up. You know, he needs to get with us on the war. You know, and that ain't going to happen. That really won't happen, but somebody doesn't read things about well. But that happens in some situations. Does that help a little bit? Okay. Characters in this age of expansion. Augustine and Monica. Augustine, of course, was from Africa, and a lot of the church was growing in Africa. His mother, Monica, was obviously a Christian, was hoping to get her son to become a Christian, and finally got Ambrose to baptize Augustine. And as she left to go back to Africa, she dies at the port city of Rome. There's a burial spot there for Monica. Augustine, some of his theology, and I can't go into details about this, but the doctrine of original sin, which is still controversial in some ways. But basically the doctrine of original sin was saying all of us as human beings, by being human, are affected by, we're flawed. We have a tendency to rather be selfish into self. We have a tendency to be greedy. We have a tendency to be violent, to do harm to other people rather than what God intended us to do. So that doctrine, that's part of the reason why we baptize, to get rid of original sin, but we're still flawed people. There's lots of different theories on original sin over the years, but some of that influence we've gotten from Augustine. Some of it's healthy, and some of it's not always so healthy. Manichaeism during this period of time was heresy, and we still see edges of this, that the body, the human body, is all bad. Only the soul is good. So the soul is that, but anything that is, and of course this becomes very anti-sexual in any way, shape. Sex is all bad. So it's better not to have sex. How we propagate the species, I don't know, but that became, and we see flaws of that coming back over and over and over again. Pelagianism, Pope Francis talked about this a lot. A heresy that people could obtain their salvation through their own efforts. I can earn my salvation. Francis said that's BS. None of us earn. We may do good works. We do good works because God loves us. We don't do good works because, okay, God, look, I've done all these good things here. You owe me heaven, because I've done these things. I went to Mass every Sunday for the last 400 years, and I slept through the whole thing, but that's okay. We don't earn heaven. And of course, that was part of the controversy of Martin Luther, as Mary Ann said. Was he speaking right? He said, we got into the idea of works that, well, if you buy a church here or build a church, you'll earn heaven, or you get indulgences. We'll talk about that later. But Pelagianism was saying, we don't earn it. It's a gift from God by grace. But that keeps coming up over and over again, even in our own time. Nestorian heresy was another one, again, that tried to separate the human and divine Jesus. Which do we follow? Leo the Great, was a great administrator and tried to kind of balance, okay, how do we balance doctrine and what we say we believe? How do we become instruments of peace in a world that's often violent? And how do we do pastoral care? We got to do all three. We need to be peacemakers. We need to do care of people as well as know our doctrine. And so often, sometimes people say, well, it's, being a Christian is, do you know the doctrine? This happens oftentimes. Some of you are in the OCIA, bad habit. There, the catechumen was always formed. How do you form people? Not always with head knowledge, but heart knowledge. And over the years, I believe if we can get to the heart, you got a convert. If it's only in the head, it ain't going to last long. You need both head and heart, but we act out our faith through our heart. And sometimes we overly intellectualize our catechumenate. Quick aside, when I was in a black community, they never had the OCIA at the time, and I said, we got to start it. And I said, what am I going to do for sponsors? And I said, we got a lot of older ladies in this parish who are really amazing people, faith-filled people. So I spotted each one of them with some of the kids in the parish as their sponsor. Those ladies could share their faith better than almost anybody I ever know, as the black community, what it meant to be a Christian. And those kids got it. And I'm always amazed when I go back to St. Augustine's, some of those kids are now the leaders of the parish today, 25 years later, 30 years later. Anyway, good thing. Sorry, the sidetracks. Patrick, my grandmother came from Cork, so I'm a fourth Irish. St. Patrick, of course, was actually from France, went to Ireland and Britain, and then tried to convert the Irish Druids, got thrown out, and then went back and restarted and went back to Ireland and converted the Irish Church as a missionary. So much of the Catholic Ireland comes from Patrick. You begin to have some of these giant missionaries. I mentioned Benedict, the father of Western monasticism, the rule of St. Benedict. Benedictines are, if you've ever been to St. Meinrad's, are to Ferdinand, Indiana, where the sisters are there. Hospitality is one of their number one values. When you come to us, we are greeting Christ in our guests, which I think we need to learn in our parishes to do a lot better work with all of that. But Benedict, his rule of St. Benedict is a very simple rule, and most other religious orders have used Benedict's rule as a model for theirs. One classic part of the rule of St. Benedict, some of you may know Father Harry Hagen. is Benedictine of St. Meinrad's. He's from Bardstown, big Wildcat fan. But I was talking with him one day, and we were talking about the rule of St. Benedict. He said, one of our rules is that when a brother or a novice is out of line, we follow the example of Jesus. You go to the person one-on-one first. That doesn't work. You get a couple of other people to go with him. That doesn't work. You go to the whole community, as Jesus says in the scriptures. St. Benedict says the same thing. So whenever we have one of the brothers to go explain the matter to him. If that doesn't work, get another brother to explain the matter to him. If that doesn't work, take him before the whole community. If that doesn't work, says Benedict, take the two largest brothers in the community to explain the matter to him. Love that line. I think there's a sign over in the Benedictines that mentions that last line, the two largest brothers. They have some large brothers there too. Obviously, I wish I could try to put more women in here, but Bridget of Kildare, another Irish lass, an abbess whose influence was much more widespread and much more powerful than the bishop of the times. And that's going to cause tension. But she was another one of those people that was a missionary and evangelist in the 500s. Okay, I'm really going to have to fly now as we go through these next centuries, the Dark Ages. These next couple of hundred years and the birth of feudalism. The culture now, the church seems to be moving further north into Germany and the Slavic nations during this particular time. But one of the challenges is, as it moves into that area, the barbarians come out of what we now would call Russia today and some other parts and begin to invade and destroy things. And a lot of times people didn't have safes. So a lot of times you buried a lot of the records. And during this period of time, a lot of the records of the early church were lost because they were buried, and if somebody got killed, nobody knew where did they bury it. It's only in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century that we've uncovered a lot of these documents, helping us to understand the earlier history of the church and many of the documents of that church. In 600 as well, the rise Muhammad is born in the late 6th century and begins to establish what we call Islam, the Muslim religion. It's one of the Abrahamic religions, as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all have their roots with Abraham. And of course, part of the challenge is, as you know, the story of the Genesis. Abraham had Sarah, and of course he had a mistress, Hagar, and she had a son, and Sarah had a son, and that caused a clash between the two women. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Something like that. And of course, Abraham had to send Hagar and her son away. And basically, the Islamic religion comes out of the Hagar and Ishmael tradition. But many of the values of much of the Pentateuch and in the Hebrew scriptures show up in Islam. Mary is a highly recognized figure. When I was in Jerusalem in a Palestinian village, I was just surprised how many times I saw pictures of Mary in Muslim homes. She is heavily revered in different ways, perhaps, than we are. But there's a lot of grounding of all three of them. If you read the Quran, which is difficult to read because it's a totally different culture, but there are common elements between our three religions, and I think we certainly need much more dialogue with it. One of my greatest experiences when I was in sabbatical in Israel 2001, I would go to an internet cafe, and the young adults there would often bring coffee by and say, come talk with us. And I had many a night talking with all of these were Muslim 20-somethings who didn't know who a priest was, never met a Catholic priest before, but we would talk about religion and our values, and it was amazing to me some of the common things that we share, and I think we need to do that. Unfortunately, at this time, too, again with the barbarians, a lot of the Greek and Roman culture, those records of the Greek and Roman also got lost. A lot of the writings of the philosophers got lost. So with all of that, with things kind of crashing in, we begin to change our churches from being around a table where we were in a semicircle, as the Second Vatican Council asked us to go back to. Suddenly we said, God is punishing us all. God is out there, and we need to have long, narrow churches where the tabernacle is in the far away, and there are screens in front of us, and we, the hoi polloi, will be outside of those screens because we don't deserve it. And so during this period of time, people didn't go to communion much because they didn't think they were worth it. And we see that kind of stretching of what it becomes the medieval churches in many different ways. Beautiful churches, as we know, but a whole different notion of the pyramid versus the concentric circle. Second Vatican Council kept talking about we're the people of God. We're a concentric circle with someone at the center, but we're all layers throughout that rather than top down. And we certainly hear Francis and Leo saying that. A lot of low self-esteem, gloom and doom. And after the barbarians began to dissipate a little bit, the German church takes over. We're going to become the Roman Empire, but we're going to be the Holy Roman Empire. And, of course, it's during this period of time of Charlemagne. So Germany begins to dominate. Rome and Italy, as I said, become backwaters, losing people. Monasticism flourishes. But the church, since the Roman Empire is now gone from Rome, the church centralizes itself in Rome. And, of course, the only real leader that's still in Rome is the Pope. So he becomes both the material, the temporal leader, the political leader, as well as the religious leader, and that always gets us in trouble, as we do. Much of the culture and common education was lost. I mentioned those pyramid structures. There's clear division between clergy and laity, and clericalism, as we call it today, began to be much more clearly defined. The priests are in charge. Whatever Father says, that's what you should do. I'm sure Father Tuan says that to you all the time. And with Islam, Africa, Northern Africa, and the Holy Land, and of course much of Turkey is lost to Islam. Oh. Gregory the Great was one of the great giants. Obviously a musician. He established what we now know as Gregorian chant. And so often that affected the church. It was a very gutsy pope, but when Attila the Hun came to the edge of Rome, the Pope went out to meet him and says, "Don't destroy the city." And Attila said, "Okay." And he didn't, because of his experience of meeting Gregory and sitting down and talking with him. Sounds like Francis a little bit later in the 13th century. Gregory became the preserver of Rome, trying to bring out of the storeroom a lot of things that had been lost. I mentioned Muhammad, founder of Islam and the Quran. Again, in Germany, one of the great giants, like Patrick in Ireland, is Boniface, the apostle to the Germans. One of the popes during that time, Leo III, we've got Leo XIV now, tried to say, how can we begin to separate the church from being too tied to the state? He didn't succeed completely, but they raised the questions. Charlemagne is the holy, I mentioned, lost a in there, Roman emperor, becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, and he asks the Pope to come and crown him. And of course, the Pope comes to crown him and starts to put the crown on his head, and Charlemagne says, "Excuse me, I'll take the crown and put it on my own head." Tells you something about who's. Let's make sure who's in charge here. That doesn't sound familiar today at all, right? In the 9th century, we have Cyril and Methodius, the apostles to the Slavic nations. I'm very conscious that we're getting very close here. Unfortunately, we're not going to have that second conversation at your tables. Cyril and Methodius are the two apostles to the Slavic nations. Again, some great missionaries of that time. The feast day for Cyril and Methodius is February 14th. Now, you all been celebrating something else on February 14th, right? Right? St. Valen something or other, who probably didn't exist. That's really the Cyril and Methodius. I always say I need to come up with Cyril and Methodius cards, and but I'm not sure it would sell, but I'd be a billionaire if I could figure that one out. But they were the great giants. Again, they helped enculturate in the Slavic nations with the Slavic languages being used within the Eucharist itself. Roman nobles controlled the papacy. Several popes got murdered during this time. One pope was elected when he was only 18. That's not going to happen anytime soon, in case anybody in our youth want to be pope, but, you know, we have a few that were pretty young. Nicholas II, well, that's created the College of Cardinals to elect the Pope. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week. Basically, that meant 7 bishops around the city of Rome would get together and elect who the next Pope is, which means it's probably always going to be a Roman Pope, right? And we've had that a long time until recently, right? Haven't had an Italian Pope now in more than almost 50 years. William the Conqueror takes over England a few years before that. I have to say, since my parish was St. Edward the Confessor, who built Westminster Abbey, William the Conqueror takes over England and begins to change England from the great Catholic nation that Edward had created. And then we have the next pope, which we go into the next epoch, is Gregory the Seventh, who was Hildebrand, a German pope, the first German pope, like Benedict the 16th. He begins to establish things like canon law and asserts authority over lay investiture, but we'll talk about that later. Barbarians I've talked about, cultural records, I think I've talked about all of this. The economic system becomes a very caste system. There's the wealthy and the elites at the top. There's almost no middle class. Everybody else is peasants. Know your place. And of course, the church adopts the same model in many different ways, which we struggle with, I think, today. The spread of the monastic movement I mentioned, Rome becomes a backwater. The schism. In 1054, the church split in half. What we call the Orthodox Church, excuse me, Jim, the Orthodox Church recognizes in Istanbul, the Patriarch of Constantinople, deals with our popes very well. We're hoping that the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church can come back together again. There's some possibilities of that, but we've got to respect their culture. And sometimes we in the West have not always done that. So that becomes a split that, theologically, our Orthodox brothers and sisters and we have almost the same theology. Their theology much more emphasizes the resurrection, so they don't have Good Friday crosses in their churches. The Western churches often emphasize Good Friday, while we have the Good Friday cross in our churches. But we need both. I've been in some churches where they've got a big cross, and for part of the year it's got the crucified Jesus, and then they flip the cross, and the second part of the year they've got the resurrected Jesus. I always thought that was an interesting image. Okay. Any quick questions about these two periods that might be helpful? Has this been helpful to you, or are you just drowning in data? I think when we see our history, we see these questions that we have today keep repeating from the past, and how different ages have tried to solve these questions, and we'll see that again. Any quick questions? Oh, I'm sorry.
Father Graffis, I would like to know, for the sake of the people who are probably watching online and
Oh.
for a lot of people here, what about your notes and what about the handouts?
You can use those handouts. We've had some handouts for you at home. You can, well, I don't know, will you have them in church or someplace, or the office will certainly have the handouts that we had tonight. I would make some extra copies for people like that.
What about
The PowerPoint, I'll see. I'll see if I could get that done for you. Anyway, let us pray. Oh, excuse me, Bob.
I told my students at the law school that I went to college at St. John's Abbey.
Right.
The Benedictines are living under the longest continuing existing law in Italy.
That's right. That's right. The rule of Benedict.
Still live under the rule of Benedict.
Yeah, it's amazing. Anyway, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, now and forever. Amen. We'll see you next week for another couple hundred years.